32. Always a good idea to keep your eye on the passage, make sure that the preacher is sticking to what the passage says. You never know with these visiting Anglicans, do you? Well, I wonder if you have ever been to court. I hope not, because when you see court scenes on television, they always look very stressful, don't they? Whether you're in the dock, whether you're a member of the jury, or whether you're called to be a witness. But as Christians, it seems to me that we always need to be ready to go to court. Of course, you may not find yourself in a pop-up court in front of a king, as Paul does, feeling as though he's on trial. You may not be called, though, to defend the gospel before kings, as Paul was in Acts 9, verse 15. But as Christ's witnesses today, it seems to me that we will all be cross-examined at one time or another. Perhaps by our colleagues at work, maybe by our school friends, or even by members of our family. And so you and I need to be ready, don't we, to give an account just as Paul was. But how should we prepare, you might ask yourself? Well, fortunately, our passage this morning gives us a few ideas. Firstly, we see that Paul keeps building bridges. Paul keeps building bridges. On the face of it, of course, Paul has very little in common with his audience. You know, this is a gathering of the great and the bad. King Agrippa is King Agrippa II. He is Herod's great-grandson, the Herod who tried to kill Jesus when he was a baby. And his father was Agrippa I, the man who James beheaded. And Bernice, of course, well, she's a pretty bad lot too. She is Agrippa's sister. By this time, she'd already had 2 children with her uncle. And also at this point, she's in an incestuous relationship with her brother, the Agrippa mentioned in this passage. But despite everything that Paul must have felt about this wonderful audience, notice how respectfully he treats them nonetheless. He waits, doesn't he, in verse 1, for an invitation to speak. And he thanks them for this opportunity to talk about Jesus Christ. But Paul also empathizes with his audience. He tells them about the time when he wasn't a Christian, when he didn't believe, as we see in verse 9. Notice too that Paul is totally honest about the many ways that he rebelled against God. He describes how he persecuted Christians, how he put them in prison, verse 10, how he voted for their deaths and pursued them even when they fled abroad. But by being respectful, by being empathetic, and by being honest, Paul is building bridges for the gospel. So when we talk to people about Jesus, we too need to show respect for them, don't we? We need to empathize with those who don't yet believe. We need to be honest about what we were like before we became Christians. And isn't that what you try to do in your church? Isn't that what you try to do at Southgate, in your groups, in groups like the Friendship Club, Spots, Coffee Stop, or Liquid? Building relationships in all these groups, relationships that communicate the love of God by being respectful, empathetic, and honest. But more than that, aren't you also building relationships that you want God to bless, so that they become bridges for the gospel of Jesus? These verses should encourage you, because you are doing what Paul did. Of course, not every church is doing this. As Michael Green once said, the church builds many bridges into the community, but too often the gospel fails to walk across them. The challenge for us as Christians is to allow God to use our groups, our events, and our relationships as bridges for the gospel. Christmas is coming, the time of year when people, we're told, are most open to the gospel, which is why we all feel frustrated this year that we can't do so many things we'd expect to do each Christmas. But we also need to think, don't we, as a church, what we can do. So this Christmas, perhaps, you could insert a Christmas testimony or maybe a Christmas story in your Christmas cards that you send out to your friends and family. You could email your friends and family a link to a Southgate Christmas service, and encourage them to join you from the comfort of their own sofa. You could use your phone to video yourself, perhaps explaining why Christmas is so special to you as a Christian, and then put it on your social media. Of course, we're all wired differently. You may have different ideas that would work better for you. But this Christmas, let's ask God how we can turn our relationships into bridges for the gospel. There's a lady in my house group whose name is Duan. She's from Thailand. She used to do a very dull admin job in a local doctor's surgery. But over the years, a GP there was kind to her. He was always took an interest in her life. So, for example, on a Monday morning, he'd asked her what she did at the weekend. In time, she'd ask him about his weekend, which gave him the chance to talk about our church. Eventually, she asked to come to church. Then she asked to do an alpha. Then she asked Jesus into her life. So let's embrace this first challenge of this passage. Let's keep building bridges for the gospel. Secondly, we see that Paul keeps giving his testimony. Paul keeps giving his testimony. In a court of law, a witness is called to give their testimony, to tell people what they've seen so people can decide and discern the truth for themselves. At the beginning of Acts, Jesus recommissions his followers to be his witnesses, as he puts it in verse 8. In other words, he called his followers to tell people what they had seen of God, so those people might discover the truth for themselves. And isn't that what Paul is doing here? He creates a wonderful opportunity to share his testimony. He tells people how he met Jesus in verse 13. How he heard a voice from heaven, how he saw a blinding light and was felled to the ground. Then he describes how Jesus spoke to him personally in verse 14, how he reached into his life and saved him. He then goes on to tell them how meeting Jesus has changed his life. You know, at the time of this encounter, Paul was probably in his 60s. In other words, he was very old for the first century. He'd been beaten up by this time. He'd been imprisoned. He'd been chased out of town. As he spoke to this group, he tells us that he was in chains. But you know, Paul has not lost his confidence in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Indeed, he finds it odd that people don't believe, verse 8. And in the face of scathing opposition, he still declares that he believes that the gospel is true and reasonable, as we see in verse 25. You know, even as an old man, Paul still wants everybody he speaks to become a Christian, verse 29. I wonder if this is still your greatest desire. Do you still see yourself as a missionary, or have you taken early retirement? If so, then you need to ask Jesus Christ to recommission you in his mission, to re-enroll you as a witness with a wonderful testimony to tell. Because a missionary always has a mission that Jesus summarizes for us in verse 18. I am sending you to open eyes, to turn them from darkness to light, from the power of Satan to God, so that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place amongst those who were sacrificed by their faith in me, who were sanctified even by their faith in me. You know, Paul shares his testimony very much like a sower, doesn't he? Indiscriminately, to the great and to the small alike, as he puts it in verse 22. I wonder if this is still what you and I are doing. You know, you may not be the next J. John, but you can still tell people how you came to believe in Jesus. You can still describe the difference that he has made in your life to date. And you know the best thing about your testimony? Nobody can ever say that it isn't true. If you haven't done so already, can I suggest that this week you write out your testimony? Why not follow the structure that Paul uses here? He describes, doesn't he, what he was like before he became a Christian. He explains how he came to believe in Jesus. And then he goes on to describe the difference that knowing Jesus has made since that day. When you've written out your testimony, why not try to learn it? And then pray to God. Ask God to give you an opportunity to share it with somebody. Think of this as your first preparation for Christmas? Some years ago, I knew an arrogant young man who used to say, you can have a faith or a brain, but you cannot have both. But one day, a Christian friend of his said, you know, you've got no idea what you were talking about. Why don't you come to church and find out the truth? If you come to church, I'll buy you a curry. The girl who invited him didn't mention that she was inviting him to a full-on guest service. But after the evening service, the young man was so blown away by what he'd heard that he didn't even claim his free curry. Instead, he just wanted to talk about the sermon, the service, and the kind of welcome he'd received in that church. A few weeks later, he signed up for a course. It was called a Just Looking course, where you could ask any question you liked about the Christian faith. 3 months later, that man became a Christian. Since then, his life has changed a lot. In fact, the last thing I heard, he was applying to be a minister in a church called Southgate. Let's keep looking for opportunities this week, shall we? Opportunities to share our testimony. Lastly, we see that Paul keeps praying for people. Paul keeps praying for people. After he shared his testimony, what reaction does Paul get? Festus repenting? Bernice wanting to be baptized? King Agrippa asking to do an alpha? Not exactly. Festus interrupts Paul and tells him that he's out of his mind, that he's gone insane, as he says in verse 24. Agrippa asks, do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to become a Christian? Verse 28. And at the end of this amazing testimony, Paul's hearers simply walk out apparently unmoved. In fact, they're talking about a completely different subject in the last 2 verses of the passage. But notice that Paul is not disillusioned, perhaps because he doesn't take opposition personally. Indeed, his testimony confirms that he's right not to do so. Because in it, Jesus tells Paul that his opposition to the gospel was not opposition to Christians, it was not opposition to the church, it was opposition to Christ himself. So when people reject what you say about Jesus, they are not rejecting you, they are rejecting Jesus Christ. And isn't this the fulfillment of Simeon's wonderful prophecy? Those spine-tingling words that he uses way back in Luke 2:34. This child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be spoken against. You know, Paul never took rejection personally. When he shares the gospel, he's realistic about his expectations. Unlike us, he doesn't expect instant results. As he says in verse 29, conversions may take a long time, or they may take a short time. But Paul's faith is in God. He knows that only God converts. So instead of taking reactions personally, instead of becoming disappointed, Paul puts his energy into praying for people, praying for the people who he has spoken to. And he tells them so in verse 29. Like Paul, we need to pray, don't we, for all the people who we talk to about Jesus Christ. A few months ago, my congregation thought that I was having a lie-in, but actually I was preaching at a local Baptist church. After the service, I met a retired couple who'd been married for 54 years. I'll call them Marion and Arthur because those were their names. Marion had been a Christian since her teens, but Arthur hadn't always been a believer. He did go to church every now and again, but only to please Marion. However, Marion kept praying for Arthur for 23 years. And so about 7 years ago, things began to change. So much so that after a very simple Anglican service on a cruise ship, Arthur sidled up to Marion and said, I've just made a commitment. That was in October 2013. At Easter time in 2014, Arthur asked the pastor how many people were going to be baptized on Easter Day. 2, said the pastor. Make that 3, Arthur smiled. 5 years ago, my prayer partner and I began praying for his daughter who wasn't a Christian. After a year of us praying for her, she moved in with her boyfriend who also wasn't a Christian. We felt really encouraged, but we kept praying. 2 years later, that relationship fell apart. In time, she came back to church. In time, she came back to God. Soon afterwards, she announced that she was holding out for a Christian man in his 30s. Good luck with that, all her non-Christian friends said. But we were encouraged. We were encouraged because she was taking a step of faith. Recently, she announced that she's getting engaged to a worship leader who's 32. Now we're praying that she will stop talking about her wedding. Paul always inspires us, doesn't he? Paul always inspires us because he reminds us that the gospel's fiercest critics can become its greatest converts. So like Paul, let's keep praying for everybody who we talk to about Jesus Christ. As a Christian, you never know when you're going to end up in court for the gospel. It might be in the pub, it might be in a restaurant, it might be over Sunday lunch. But the question is, will you and I be ready? Paul was, and so he kept building bridges. He keeps giving his testimony. He kept praying for the people he'd spoken to. In the 1950s, the evangelist Billy Graham came to Britain. He preached the gospel in 11 football stadiums up and down the UK. Because of the impact of his rallies, Billy Graham was often on television being interviewed. On one occasion, a cynical BBC interviewer asked him why he spent so long organising so many rallies in so many stadiums, speaking so many nights to so many people at such great personal cost. Billy Graham looked the interviewer in the eye and he said, because if we want people to enter heaven, they must hear the gospel and they must be born again. Amen.